Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. In this episode, we're going to unpack the myths surrounding GTO and show you how to turn solver-based play into a source of real EV. You'll learn how to spot the cracks and how to exploit them. We break down the key weaknesses in solver output, like finite sizings, predictable lines, and stack depth limitations. You'll also discover how concepts like timing tails and unorthodox plays can throw even the most, quote, optimal players off their game. But before we dive into the full episode, I just wanted to let you know that we've recently added a brand new course to the Pro membership. Aptly named Myths of Poker, this 15-lesson course explores and debunks common myths around poker strategy, math, the ecosystem, and more. Many of these myths are even believed by otherwise solid players. If you're already a Pro member, just log into the site and go to Browse Pro Videos and go to the courses page. And if you're not yet a member, now's a great time to join and watch this course and many others. Just visit redchip.poker/pro, P-R-O, to learn more and sign up. With that said, here's Coach Weasel to break it all down. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is Crushing GTO. We're going to be having a little bit of fun in this Red Chip Poker Podcast episode. We're going to be imagining we're playing against solver output, and we're going to discuss strategies for generating a positive win rate against the solver. Now, many of you will have the belief that it's not possible to generate a positive win rate against solver output. The best we can do against GTO is to break even. But the truth is that solver output is not GTO poker. It's what we can refer to as an ultra-weak solution to the game of poker. This is something we discussed in the previous Red Chip Poker Podcast episode with the title, Is Poker Dead? If you're interested in finding out more about the different types of solve, make sure to check out that episode. You might enjoy listening to that episode before listening to this episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The key takeaway for us is that solver output is technically exploitable because it's not a perfect GTO solution to the game. The question is how? How do we exploit solver output? That's what we're going to be talking about in this episode. Let's imagine we have an opponent who is clicking through a set of pre-solved GTO grids. Any situation that player pulls up the relevant grid, perhaps makes use of a randomizer, and executes the correct play according to solver output. We're going to list the various problems that our opponent will have trying to follow solver output. The first problem we can refer to as the finite sizing problem. One of the ways that solver output differs from a full GTO solve is that solver output is going to be based around a tree that has a finite amount of sizings. Let's take pre-flop as an example. Imagine a spot where our opponent is defending his big blind pre-flop versus our button open. What does his defending range look like? Well, ideally it should depend on the sizing, but how many different sizings does our opponent have in his pre-solved solution? For example, some GTO pre-solved solutions only have a single sizing. For example, our opponent might have a grid that shows him how to defend big blind against a button 2.5x open. What that means is if we open 2.5x on the button, our opponent is going to defend close to perfectly. He has a grid that deals with that precise situation. What happens if we open to 3 big blinds, but our opponent only has a grid that deals with 2.5 big blind opens? What does he do in that situation? There's a couple of things that our opponent might try to do. The first thing is he might just use his 2.5 defending grid. In other words, we're opening to 3 big blinds, but the closest thing that our opponent has is a grid that shows him how to defend against 2.5 big blinds. So he just uses that grid instead. If our opponent was making use of a bot, well, a bot has to pick something, right? And what a GTO bot will typically do is pick the closest available solution. It doesn't have defending range against 3 big blinds. It just uses the defending range against 2.5 big blinds. Now, as it happens, big blind cold calling ranges differ a lot based on a small change in open raise sizing. In other words, cold calling range big blind versus button 2.5x is quite a bit different from big blind cold calling range against a button 3x. So if we open raise to 3x, our opponent doesn't have that specific grid, he's going to make a mistake with his defending range. Of course, the other thing a human opponent might do is acknowledge that the sizing's different. I only have a defend versus 2.5x open grid. I know I'm supposed to defend tighter against a 3x, so I'm going to approximate how much tighter I should be defending against a larger open. But guess what? Our opponent's not playing GTO anymore. If he's approximating how much he needs to adjust, that's not a decision based around a GTO grid. Now, of course, an advanced user of GTO trees may have several sizings. They may have defending against 3x, 2.5x, min-raise even, 3.5x perhaps. Do they have 2.7? Possibly not. Do they have 2.2? The key idea is that unless our opponent has an infinite array of sizings, which he won't have, because that would imply that he'd fully solved the game of No Limit Hold'em, there's going to be a sizing that our opponent doesn't have a grid for. And if we pick one of those sizings, he's not going to know the correct GTO response against that sizing. He'll be over-defending, under-defending. The point is, he'll be deviating from theory, allowing us to generate an exploit. So the way we take advantage of the finite sizing problem is by using sizings that don't exist within our opponent's tree. We could even go so far as to say, as a general principle, a 2.6 big blind open is probably better than 2.5 big blind open on the button. The reason the principle works that way is because probably our opponents looked at a defending range against 2.5, but who's looked at a specific defending range for 2.6 or 2.7? Hardly anyone. As soon as we pick sizings our opponent is less studied against, they're more likely to be making mistakes. The next problem we can refer to as the finite line problem. It's very similar to the finite sizing problem. What does a solver do versus a line that's not in its tree? Sometimes we get solutions to the game where donk bets are excluded from the game tree. So if the solver just doesn't have that line as part of its tree, how does it respond against donk bets? What does the solver do versus a line that's not in its tree? If it's a poker bot, it's going to have to choose the closest available solution, which may not be that accurate at all. If it's a human, they're going to have to approximate, or once again, they're going to have to pick a solution they feel is similar, but it's not going to be the correct GTO solution to a certain spot. Another example here could be cold calling ranges from non-big blind positions. Many GTO grids don't even have small blind cold calling ranges. That means that the solver doesn't know how to play against a small blind cold call, doesn't have the defense grid for that. Or let's say, for example, UTG open raises and we decide to cold call in MP. If our human opponent doesn't have grids that involve MP cold calls, he's not going to have post-flop grids in that scenario either. How does he adjust? Again, he has to look for a line that he feels closest match, given the grids he has available, or he's going to have to approximate. Once again, as soon as we get our opponent approximating as a human, he's not playing GTO poker anymore. That means he's going to be exploitable. Another very similar problem, the finite stack depth problem. If we think about most solutions to the game of poker, they're either solved at a single stack depth, usually 100 big blinds, or if we have a very advanced solution to the game, it may be solved at regular increments. For example, we might have a solution at 100, 120, 150, 200. But if we pick any stack depth that's not explicitly covered by our opponent's grids, technically our opponent doesn't know how to play against that. For example, what would happen if we were 80 big blind effective and the closest grid that our opponent had was based around 100 big blind effective stacks? Well, our opponent's probably just going to be using the 100 big blind grid or the 100 big blind solve to make his decisions. But that's not going to match up accurately or perfectly to the 80 big blind solve. In other words, if we're playing at a stack depth that our opponent doesn't have grids for, he's going to be deviating from the correct GTO solution. It means he's making mistakes. It means we can begin to generate exploits against that. Now, if you're keeping up to date with the available poker tech, you'll know that we have access to something that we can refer to as real-time resolves. It's the idea that it's possible to very, very quickly resolve from a current node for the rest of the tree. So to give you a simple example, imagine we're in a flop situation. Let's pretend we are the opponent who has a GTO grid, and we face a sizing that's not covered by grids. So let's say we know how to play against small, medium, large, and overbets, but specifically the overbet sizing we've used as part of our GTO grid is 125% pot, but our opponent decides to bet 170% pot. Now, of course, what we could do is say, well, the closest I've got here is the 120% pot size bet on the flop. I'll use that grid, even though it's clearly not quite right. Or, harnessing the modern power of technology, we can say, I'm going to quickly resolve for this situation. I know what the current ranges are. Let's rerun the solve and include the 170% sizing in that situation. So now we do have a GTO correct defense. We have a grid for that specific sizing, because we've resolved in a matter of seconds. The question is, does that allow us to overcome the finite sizing problem? And although it helps to some extent, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You see, at the point of resolving, a finite amount of nodes still need to be used for the rest of the tree. So we resolve on the flop, but remember the EVs for the flop resolve are going to be dependent on the sizings we have available for the later nodes. So the thing is, we can't just resolve on the flop, and then when we face an unorthodox sizing on the turn, we just resolve again on the turn, because now that means our assumptions regarding the flop play were not accurate. So if later nodes are adjusted on the fly, i.e. the turn, then assumptions regarding the current node, i.e. the flop, become inaccurate. We really need to know all of the possible sizings that our opponent may use at the very beginning of the hand. But if we knew that, we would have an infinite amount of sizings available. Once again, that would mean we have a full solution to the game of poker, which doesn't exist. The game tree is still too complex. Now, I don't doubt that a real-time resolve could increase the efficiency of an opponent who's deliberately trying to follow solver output, if we assume they were cheating, for example, making use of real-time assistance. But it's not enough to completely eradicate that problem of finite sizings that are used as part of the original game tree. Now let's talk about something a little bit different, which I'll refer to as out-of-band data. So we have a human opponent, let's say for argument's sake, he's clicking through GTO grids as he makes his decision. There's certain information that's not part of solver output. Think about any poker concept or variable that's not directly addressed by the solver, which could cause information to be leaked regarding our opponent's hand strength. Simple example could be timing tells or other sorts of tells. Possibly if you're interested in poker, you'll have seen the classic poker movie Rounders. And you know that the problem that Teddy KGB has is every time he has a strong hand, he eats an Oreo. Now, of course, it's a very silly, completely contrived representation of how poker tells work. But think about this question. If Teddy KGB was playing a perfect GTO strategy, not even solver output, let's just say that Teddy KGB has the ultimate complete solution to no limit hold'em. If he was following that solution, would it matter that he ate an Oreo every time he has a strong hand? Or is GTO completely unbeatable? He could just eat his Oreos all day, but because he's playing GTO poker, there's no counter strategy against that. What do you think? The answer is that ultimate solution to poker or not, Teddy KGB is very likely going to get completely destroyed. GTO poker is not the dominant strategy in poker. We're perhaps conditioned to think it is. It's like the holy grail. It's the epitome of what we're striving for as poker players. But the truth is, GTO poker is not even the dominant strategy. The dominant strategy in poker is clairvoyance. So if we could see our opponent's hole cards, it doesn't matter if our opponent is playing a perfect GTO solution, he is still going to lose if we understand how to use his hole card data properly, which is not necessarily that difficult. Even if our opponent's following solver output, if he's leaking information through physical or timing tells, we can still generate a very high win rate against a GTO strategy because we're making use of out-of-band data. Now, it could be that our opponent is a bot that's making use of solver output. And we might think, well, it's a bot, so maybe not going to have any timing tells. Perhaps it's just coded to always take the same amount of time for each decision, and it's not going to have any other types of tells. So that means we can't access any of the out-of-band data. Truth is that if you've ever spent time playing against poker bots, whether they're GTO-based or non-GTO-based, you'll know that they have a tendency to leak data they're not supposed to. Even if they've been programmed to act in 5 seconds time or 10 seconds time, that's not always possible. For example, imagine we had a poker bot that always takes exactly 10 seconds to act. This particular poker bot plays a bunch of tables. If it has an easy decision, it waits 10 seconds. Then the tougher decisions, maybe it could take up to 10 seconds to make the decision, but the bot has been coded to always act in 10 seconds. Even with the best intentions, that action timing is not necessarily something that we would have full control over as, let's say, a bot developer. There will be ways that we can slow the script down and cause the script to take different amounts of time with different amounts of hands. There might be slightly more computationally intensive decisions we can put the bot through that end up revealing its hand strength. We could actually force the poker bot to take longer amounts of time depending on the type of hand that it has. Now, that's just one example. The point is that even computers that have been programmed not to leak data have a tendency towards leaking data that they're not supposed to. We just have to figure out how to trigger it. So if, for example, we think, well, it's a computer, it's not going to give off any tells, that couldn't be further from the truth. And in the wild, those types of safeguards are not necessarily implemented. For example, there may not be any kind of action timing on an action from a bot. Maybe the developer just lets the bot take as long as the bot needs. Then all of a sudden, the bot is now revealing out-of-band information to us. It may be playing a perfect GTO strategy, but we might be able to figure out what type of hand the bot has based on how long it takes to act. Let's move on now to our next area, and this is very closely related to the finite line problem, and that is multi-way pots. When we think about GTO solutions to the game of poker, it's very often a large collection of post-flop heads-up grids. In fact, most poker solver work has to do with heads-up post-flop play. Multi-way pots, not really covered intensively by the majority of solvers. Even the ones that cover multi-way, still in the fairly early, more primitive stages. What this means is our GTO-based opponent, who's maybe making use of grids, potentially can't make use of any grids if playing in a multi-way situation. So what does our opponent do in that case? Once again, he either has to pick the closest available grid, or he has to approximate play as a human player. So if we did have someone who was very, very clearly basing their play around GTO grids, the objective is to funnel them into as many situations as possible that are not covered by their grids. So we're forcing them into multi-way pots. We're making use of very unorthodox sizings that won't be covered. We're maybe deliberately playing at an effective stack depth that we don't think that they have solved for. Now keep in mind that this was designed more as a fun episode to get you thinking about how we could beat solver output. If we had the mission of trying to beat someone who is making use of solver output, this is how we'd go about finding exploits against solver output. But although solver output is technically beatable, and it's fun to think about the ways that we might beat a solver strategy, this does not necessarily mean that we should be trying to do this. So this was mostly for theoretical / entertainment reasons, because if we know our opponent is clearly cheating, if he's making use of RTA assistance, either manual RTA clicking through solver grids, or if he's making use of a bot to execute solver output, that's probably not someone we want to play against. Although it's someone we might be able to technically beat using the techniques discussed in this podcast episode, that's really not going to be a soft opponent. Better courses of action probably to avoid this particular opponent. Or if we really suspect someone is cheating and they are detracting from the traffic, it might be a good idea to file a report with the poker site's security team and potentially get that particular player banned. Now, what if our opponent is not someone who's actively cheating, but someone who spends a long time looking at GTO grids, then attempts to replicate that in game? In other words, how should we play against GTO-based opponents who are not necessarily using solver output in game? Now, any of the techniques may prove effective if you are using sizings that they haven't studied against, or stack depths, or lines that they haven't studied against. You're going to find that they're going to be more exploitable in those lines. For example, we considered 2 lines that the average player may not study too much in the session. Something like donk betting could be a line that our opponent hasn't invested a lot of time looking at the relevant solver grids. Could also be something like small blind cold calling or cold calling from MP. Maybe our opponent hasn't looked at grids in those scenarios as well. So any of the techniques we've discussed may prove effective against GTO-based opponents as well. But it's important to keep in mind that a player who is studying GTO and attempting to play GTO is going to be very different from someone who's actively using real-time assistance in-game. The non-cheating opponents are not really playing solver output. What they're really doing is using GTO principles to inform some of their decisions. And we find if a player is studying GTO and then attempting to replicate that in-game without using any kind of solver output, they won't be able to do it that accurately. And we generally find that even GTO-based players actually have a large amount of zones where they're exploitable. So we can just treat them like any other opponent. We look for the exploits, we target the exploits. Real-time assistance players will be quite a bit different from that. They won't really have any obvious zones where they can be exploited. And that's why, although it's interesting from a theory perspective to consider how we still might beat a real-time assistance player. In reality, playing against them is still probably not the best course of action. We either want to avoid such a player or potentially report them to the security team. Okay, so hopefully this broadened your horizons somewhat in terms of thinking about different types of GTO strategy. Thanks very much for tuning in. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. Like I mentioned at the top of the episode, our new course, Myths of Poker, is available now for all pro members. And since Coach Weasel created this entire course, it seemed pertinent to just play the intro video for the course. So here it is for you.
This is going to be a quick introduction to the course. We'll outline the key objectives of the course and also what you can expect throughout this course. This is a course on the myths of poker. We're going to be talking about myths players believed in the past about the game of poker. We're also going to be talking about myths that players still believe today. So there's going to be a nice mixture of learning about poker history. So if you are a relative newcomer to the game, you'll find out how players used to think about the game in the past, how that's evolved, how certain myths surrounding the game of poker were debunked. But also, you'll learn about the persistent myths that many players believe today about the game. And in many cases, even some advanced players are propagating some of these myths surrounding the game of poker. The key objectives of the course are as follows. Key objective number 1, to encourage independent lateral thinking. In other words, we don't want to outsource all of our thinking to other players in the industry. We need to be able to think laterally by ourselves about certain poker concepts so that we can decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, which information we'll accept, which information we'll discard. Another way of expressing this is that we're encouraging the filtering of all information received from other players, no matter how good they're perceived to be at the game. So even if a very experienced high-stakes player is giving us information about the game, we still need to think laterally about that information. There needs to be a filtering process in place where we say, okay, I'm going to accept 90% of what this player is telling me, but this 10% here, that doesn't actually tie in with objective reality about the game of poker. To all intents and purposes, it's a myth surrounding the game that perhaps many players believe, but we want to reject that particular myth in order to generate the highest win rates in the game. So throughout this course, you'll be able to sharpen your knowledge in commonly misunderstood areas of poker. Obviously, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of all of the various myths players believe, but it will give you examples of how to think laterally about certain concepts, what players believe, and why those ideas are inaccurate. So when you do come across other myths in the poker community outside the ones we discuss in this course, you'll be able to think objectively about whether those myths actually carry truth about the game of poker. Now, throughout the course, we'll be referencing various sources. We actually want to trace many of these myths back to some of their origins. And some of these sources are going to include high-profile poker players, authors, and forum posters. And we're not necessarily saying that these are bad players. Yes, in many cases, they might be propagating a specific myth about the game of poker, but the reality is that there are so many myths out there surrounding the game that many good players also get swept along with quite a number of these myths, and it's only after the evolution of time and study that those myths begin to disappear from a poker player's thought process. So we're always going to have some incorrect ideas about the game. This is a normal part of development, but obviously the more of those myths that we can debunk, then the larger the percentage of accurate thought processes we're going to have about the game of poker. So we're not discrediting any of the sources mentioned in this particular video series. We're simply highlighting that the myth does exist and seeing examples of how those myths have been propagated throughout poker history. So hopefully this should be an eye-opening and also entertaining poker course if you want to learn a little bit about our history as poker players. Thanks very much for checking out this introduction video, and I look forward to catching you guys in the rest of the course.
If that's catching your attention and you want to study myths around the red line, around GTO, around 1- alpha, around ace-king commitment, and more, sign up today for pro and start this course right away. Just visit redchip.poker/pro to upgrade to pro right now. I can't wait to hear what you think about the course, and in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.